The reactors had already done what they were supposed to do. When the earthquake struck Fukushima Daiichi on 11 March 2011, Units 1, 2, and 3 automatically shut down. The nuclear chain reaction stopped, but the heat did not. Inside the fuel, radioactive fission products continued to decay, producing heat that still had to be removed. So the critical question was no longer whether the reactors could generate electricity, it was whether the systems keeping them safe could continue working after the plant itself had lost power. Fukushima Daiichi was built around a principle known as defense in depth. Safety did not depend on one machine. If normal electrical power was lost, emergency diesel generators could provide AC power. If AC power became unavailable, batteries could provide DC power for essential controls and instrumentation. Different cooling systems provided additional protection. The architecture was built around layers, but layers only work when they are independent enough to survive the same threat. That would become the central weakness at Fukushima. After shutdown, decay heat falls rapidly, but it does not disappear. If cooling is lost, water begins to boil away. As the water level falls, fuel can become uncovered. Temperatures can then rise high enough to damage the fuel and its zirconium alloy cladding. At high temperatures, zirconium reacts with steam and generates hydrogen. So shutting down a reactor does not end the danger. It begins with a different problem, removing the heat that remains. At 2:46 p.m., the magnitude 9.0 Great East Japan earthquake struck offshore. Units 1, 2, and 3 were operating. The 3 reactors automatically inserted their control rods and successfully shut down. But the earthquake also caused the loss of off-site electrical power. That was serious, but it was an anticipated emergency. Emergency diesel generators started and initially supplied AC power to essential equipment. For the moment, the safety architecture was absorbing the damage. Then the tsunami arrived. The first major waves reached Fukushima Daiichi at about 3:27 p.m. A larger wave followed around 3:35. Water flooded the site. Around Units 1 to 4, inundation reached roughly 11.5 to 15.5 meters above the plant's reference elevation, far exceeding the assumptions behind the site's tsunami protection. The formal tsunami assessments used for the plant had produced estimates around 5.4 to 5.7 meters, later revised to approximately 6.1 meters. But there was another part of the story. In 2008, TEPCO carried out trial calculations using different tsunami assumptions. One produced a maximum wave height of about 10.2 meters. Another hypothetical scenario produced an estimated run-up of approximately 15.7 meters at the southern part of the site. These were not precise predictions of the March 2011 tsunami. They were scenario calculations based on assumptions whose applicability was debated. TEPCO did not treat them as sufficient grounds for immediate major countermeasures. The significance is therefore not that the company knew exactly what would happen. It did not. The significance is that substantially larger tsunami scenarios had been identified before the disaster, while adequate protection against an event of that scale had not been completed. Then the real wave arrived. Water reached critical electrical equipment. Emergency diesel generators were flooded or rendered unusable. Switchgear was damaged. Many batteries and electrical distribution systems were also lost or became unavailable. This was not simply a generator failure. AC power was disappearing. DC power was disappearing. Instrumentation and control capability were being degraded. The tsunami had attacked several functions that different safety systems depended upon. The reactors were still shut down, but the infrastructure required to keep removing their remaining heat was disappearing. Inside the control rooms, operators faced darkness, damaged equipment, failing instruments, and limited communications. They were trying to determine what still worked, while the plant became progressively harder to control. And the 3 reactors did not follow identical paths. Unit 1 was especially vulnerable. Its isolation condenser, or IC, was designed to remove heat by allowing steam to pass through heat exchangers outside the reactor vessel, where it could condense and return as water. After the earthquake, the system started automatically. Operators then stopped and restarted it because the reactor was cooling too quickly. Procedures required them to control the cooldown rate to avoid excessive thermal stress. Just before the tsunami, the isolation condenser had stopped. Then the flooding destroyed much of the electrical capability needed to monitor and control it. DC power was lost. Operators no longer had reliable indications of important valve positions. They attempted to restore cooling, but could not establish effective operation. The problem was not simply that the tsunami switched off a cooling system. It removed the power, information, and control capability needed to manage that system under deteriorating conditions. Other emergency systems were also affected. At Unit 1, high-pressure coolant injection could not be maintained after the loss of DC power needed for its operation. As pressure and temperature changed, alternative water injection became increasingly difficult. Low-pressure injection could not simply force water into a reactor vessel that remained at high pressure. The reactor had to be depressurized sufficiently first. But the valves and supporting controls required for pressure management were themselves affected by the loss of power and instrumentation. The crisis had become a chain of dependencies. Power was needed to control valves. Valves were needed to manage pressure. Pressure had to be reduced before alternative injection could work effectively. Without sufficient injection, the fuel continued heating. Units 2 and 3 followed different paths. Their emergency cooling systems continued operating much longer. Steam-driven systems such as reactor core isolation cooling provided valuable periods of cooling without relying entirely on normal AC power. Unit 3 also used its high-pressure coolant injection system for a period. These systems bought time, but they were not permanent solutions. Eventually, cooling and injection capability deteriorated. Water levels fell. Pressure became a major obstacle. Electrical infrastructure remained damaged. The plant was not moving from safe to unsafe in one instant. It was losing options. At Unit 1, the consequences became severe first. As fuel became uncovered and overheated, zirconium cladding reacted with steam and generated hydrogen. Hydrogen accumulated inside the reactor building. On 12 March, an explosion destroyed much of the upper portion of the Unit 1 reactor building. It was not a nuclear explosion. It was a hydrogen explosion, produced by the accident conditions. Unit 3 followed a similar but not identical path. Its emergency cooling lasted longer, but conditions eventually deteriorated. Fuel damage generated hydrogen. On 14 March, a massive hydrogen explosion destroyed much of the upper portion of the Unit 3 reactor building. Unit 2 also suffered severe loss of cooling and extensive fuel damage, but followed a different progression. There was no confirmed hydrogen explosion destroying its upper reactor building in the same way as Units 1 and 3. And then another part of the plant revealed how interconnected the accident had become. Unit 4 had been shut down for maintenance, and its reactor core contained no fuel because the fuel had been moved to the spent fuel pool. Yet on 15 March, its reactor building also suffered a hydrogen explosion. Investigations found strong evidence that hydrogen generated during the Unit 3 accident traveled through interconnected exhaust and venting pathways towards Unit 4. Hydrogen accumulated there, and it exploded. Unit 4 had become part of the accident without its own reactor operating. That mattered because it demonstrated that the boundaries between systems and buildings were not always the boundaries the accident respected. The plant was revealing its hidden connections, and that led investigators to a deeper question. Why could one external event disable so many functions required to keep the reactors safe? The answer was not that Fukushima had no backups. It had many. The deeper problem was that critical systems shared vulnerabilities. Emergency generators could be flooded. Switchgear could be flooded. Batteries could be flooded. Electrical distribution could be damaged. Heat removal infrastructure could be lost. The systems could appear separate on a diagram while remaining vulnerable to the same physical event. That is common mode failure. If 5 emergency systems depend on equipment in the same flood-prone area, the number 5 becomes misleading. They are separate systems. They are not truly independent. The Japanese National Diet's Independent Investigation Commission examined the accident and concluded that Fukushima could not be understood simply as an unavoidable natural catastrophe. It identified failures involving regulation, oversight, preparedness, and organizational decision-making, and described the accident as foreseeable in important respects. That did not mean the earthquake or tsunami were caused by human decisions. They were natural hazards. The deeper issue was how those hazards had been assessed, prepared for, and protected against. The 2008 calculations did not prove that the exact 2011 tsunami had been predicted, but they showed that substantially larger tsunami scenarios had been considered before the disaster. Uncertainty was real. But uncertainty creates a risk management decision. How large should the threat be? How much protection is enough when the consequence of being wrong could be catastrophic? Fukushima exposed the danger of answering those questions by examining each safety layer separately. A generator can be reliable, a battery can be reliable, a cooling system can be reliable, yet the overall system can remain vulnerable if they share the same weakness. That was the deeper failure. The tsunami was the initiating external hazard. But the nuclear accident developed because that hazard disabled multiple functions needed to maintain cooling, control, and heat removal. The consequences extended far beyond the plant. Large areas surrounding Fukushima were evacuated. Communities were displaced. Land and infrastructure required monitoring and remediation. The accident created enormous social and economic disruption, while decommissioning would stretch across decades. Fukushima also changed how nuclear regulators around the world approached severe external hazards. Plants were reassessed for flooding, loss of power, emergency cooling, and severe accident response. The questions became harder. What if normal power is lost? What if emergency generators fail? What if batteries fail? What if operators lose reliable information? What if several reactors are affected at once? And what if an external event damages equipment that supposedly independent safety systems have in common? Fukushima began with a reactor doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It shut down. The chain reaction stopped. But the heat remained. The tsunami did not need to destroy the reactor vessels. It needed to reach the infrastructure that several protective layers depended upon. That is the central lesson. Fukushima was not simply a story about a tsunami overwhelming a nuclear plant. It was a story about a complex safety architecture encountering an external event that crossed boundaries the architecture had treated as sufficiently independent. The plant had backups, but the backups shared vulnerabilities. And when the same event reached those vulnerabilities, redundancy began to disappear. The most dangerous weakness in a complex system is not always the component that fails. Sometimes it is the assumption that several components will never fail together. At Fukushima, the tsunami exposed that assumption, and the lesson extends far beyond nuclear power. When connections remain genuinely independent, redundancy can protect a system. When they share the same hidden weakness, one event can make an entire architecture fail as if it were one machine. The reactors shut down, the heat remained, and somewhere between those two facts was the weakness that turned a shutdown into a nuclear crisis. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden weaknesses inside the systems we trust.